Welcome everyone to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's webinar on source reduction assistance grants and our federal announcement of availability. We are happy to have you in attendance today. My name is Michelle Amhaz and I will be your presenter today. I am the program manager for the Source Reduction Assistance Grant Program within EPA's Chemistry, Economics, and Sustainable Strategies Division, headquartered in Washington, D.C. And I am joined today by our webinar host and facilitator, Kathleen Compton from EPA Region 10 out in Seattle, Washington. And I'm also joined today by my colleague, Brian Clapp, who will join me in presenting the material today. So before we begin, I'd like to go over some housekeeping items. So I'm going to ask Kat to advance to slide number 2. So the logistics for today. Please know that this webinar is being recorded. All attendee lines have been muted and you will be in listen-only mode. If you have any technical difficulties, we ask that you please use the GoToWebinar Help button on the taskbar within the GoToWebinar control panel to seek out help. We will have 2 question and answer sessions during this webinar. To ask a question, please type your question in the questions tab on the right-hand side of your screen. When submitting a question, we ask that you please identify yourself by name and organization, and also note the slide number that you are addressing. This will help our webinar host facilitate the session and also manage the time. I also want to point out that the slide presentation, a copy of the RFA or the request for applications, and a copy of our NEA grant slides are located in the handouts tab. So feel free to please download those onto your computer so you have them at your resource. We will make every effort to have the slide presentation and the webinar transcript posted to our P2 grant homepage as soon as we can. At the end of this webinar, you will be asked to evaluate the material presented here today. And so you will be prompted at the end to answer 3 short evaluation questions, and we ask and we encourage you and welcome your feedback on providing the evaluation, because we would like to know how to improve our presentation material going forward. So please participate in that survey. Thank you for doing that. So with that, let us dive in and let's advance to slide number 3. So the goals of the webinar are to provide an overview of the Source Reduction Assistance Grant Program, request for applications, and also provide information and answer questions about the application and review process to help potential applicants submit high-quality applications. I would also like to add some additional things here. The RFA was posted on March 4th. So it has been out for a few weeks. Please note that we have extended the application submission deadline to Friday, May 15th due to COVID-19 issues. Also, I wanted to note that I recognize some of you attending today are new to applying for federal grants, or you might be new to applying to this grant program in particular. However, I do know there are others joining today that may be seasoned applicants who have applied to federal grants before. Because we have this dynamic of attendees, I will try to address both groups and will attempt to seek a balance for presenting the material today. As such, we will touch on all aspects of the RFA. But because we do have a lot of information to cover, we will proceed rather quickly through some of the slides. At the end of the webinar, resources will be provided for those needing additional help and information. And so just to wrap this up, the core objective here is to have all attendees come away from the webinar feeling like they have a good starting point to conceptualize their SRA grant projects and to begin drafting their applications if they haven't already. So let's go on to the next slide, slide number 4. You should see the agenda. We do have a lot to cover. We're going to first start with describing the SRA grant opportunity and all the elements that attribute to that. Then we will take a break for questions. Then we will follow up with providing information on the performance measures and reporting for grant activities. We will also cover the application submission and evaluation process. Then we will go into offering some tips and resources, and then we will wrap things up by having a final break for questions. Okay, slide number 5. So what is P2? There are 3 parts to this. So P2 is any practice that reduces the amount of hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant entering any waste stream or otherwise released into the environment prior to recycling of discarded material, treatment, or disposal, and addresses the hazards and reduces the hazards to public health, the environment, and the associated release of those substances, pollutants, or contaminants. So that is the first part of what is P2. The other components listed on slide number 6 is that P2 is any practice that increases the efficient use of water, energy use, or the use of raw materials, or taking other actions that protect natural resources prior to recycling, cleanup, or disposal. The third element here to consider is that P2 is a practice that may protect natural resources through conservation methods or in-process recycling. So what do we mean when we say in-process recycling? This means, say there's a business, a facility, or another entity makes improvements to reuse the material within that business facility during the production process, such that all the process improvements are contained within that one business or facility. So everything is contained, all the process improvements are contained of reusing the material within the same facility or business. And that's what we mean by in-process recycling. This is also a good time to mention that throughout this presentation, you will hear the terms pollution prevention, P2, and source reduction. And I want to point out that these terms are all synonymous and are interchangeable. So please make a note of that. Okay, we're going to go to the next slide, slide number 7. So now that we've covered what is P2, what is not P2. What is not P2 are practices that will alter the physical, chemical, or the biological characteristics or volume of a pollutant, a hazardous substance, or contaminant through a process or activity that is not in itself integral to the necessary production of the product or the service that's being provided. So let's go a bit deeper. We're talking about recycling of discarded materials, waste, cleanup, disposal activities, the management or the processing of non-hazardous solid waste. If any of these activities represent more than a small part of your SRA grant project work, EPA will not consider the application for award. So these things can represent an ancillary part of your project work, but they can't represent the primary part of your project work because it's not P2. Okay, let's advance to slide number 8. So here is the preferred approach. And what you're seeing here is a diagram that shows an inverted pyramid. And we're basically laying out how the agency prioritizes practices for protecting our air, water, and land. Slide number 10, we're going to address the eligibility. We do have a wide pool of acceptable applicants here. any of the 50 states, the District of Columbia, U.S. Virgin Islands, the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, any territory or possession of the United States, federally recognized Indian tribes, intertribal consortia, any agency or instrumentality of a state or tribe, including state colleges and universities, local governments, nonprofits, and grassroots community organizations. So we do have a wide pool of applicants. And let's go to the next slide. I want to spend a little time on this slide because I do want to cover the notable changes that have been made since the last SRA grant competition cycle. So I'm going to spend a little time here. So I've given you some background, and we're going to switch gears a little bit. So under the last SRA grant competition cycle, the first big change to mention is that we've had to change the mechanism for soliciting funds to announce the availability of grant funding. And we've had to switch from an RFP, which is a request for proposals, to an RFA, which is a request for applications. So now that we're under an RFA, we do need to receive full applications, and these are required from each applicant. So what does this mean? This means that all application forms and the project narrative need to be submitted by the EPA submission deadline, which has now been extended to May 15th. And so a long story short, you might be wondering, why did we make this change? Well, basically the program is following agency protocol. We've been directed by the agency to make sure that we address the new application and submission procedures under grants.gov. And grants.gov serves as the agency's primary mode for receiving grant applications. So with this change in direction from an RFP to an RFA, or request for applications, applicants are being asked to provide EPA with 3 additional forms, and those are the standard form 424, which is an application for federal assistance, the standard form 424A, which is a budget application form, and in addition, the EPA form 4700, which is a pre-award compliance review report that is needed for all applicants requesting federal financial assistance. So these forms that I've just mentioned are required in addition to all the other materials that are needed to complete your application. The content and format for preparing your application package, as well as instructions for how to prepare your application, are laid out in section 4B of the SRA RFA, or request for applications. So please do take a look, please read within the entirety all of the RFA, but the content and format, really do pay attention to section 4B. The other notable changes that I wanted to note here is that the program has changed the national emphasis areas, or NEAs. And on this point, our program has provided information about the new NEAs, and we provide that information on our homepage, and I'll address a little bit more on that. And we've also made changes to the RFA by clarifying what we mean by grant reporting and what requirements are needed from the grantees. We're asking grantees to develop case studies of grant work, and so again, this is all provided in the RFA as well. We did do a lot of work on streamlining the solicitation to make it easier to read. We do understand that it's a lot of pages to get through, but we did try to make each section clearer, so it's easier to understand and follow. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So the desired work. EPA is interested in receiving applications that describe how P2 technical assistance will be provided to businesses and others Number 2 is we're going to identify, applicants will need to identify and to support at least one of the NEAs, and I will get into that in a little bit later in the presentation. The other desired work is that you fully describe your project work, how the project will support at least one of the NEAs, that you're laying out a comprehensive plan for reporting your grant results, and that you develop at least one case study. So those are the elements of the desired work. And let's go to the next slide. Now we're going to take a little time to switch back into the background of the program just to sort of give you a sense of what grant funding is available. EPA anticipates releasing approximately $1.3 million in grant funding over a 2-year period. Individual grant awards may potentially be in the range of $20,000 to $200,000 for the 2-year funding period. Funds will be incrementally funded per year. So in a 1-year time frame, if you receive a $20,000 grant for 2 years, $10,000 will be issued the first year, and then $10,000 will be issued the second year. Some EPA regions have decided to have lower award caps, and we'll note those in a little while. And the average number of awards that we're anticipating are 20 awards through this grant program. Okay, next slide, slide 14. Here, I'm just offering you the regions that do have lower funding caps, region 2, 5, 9, and 10. So if you are an applicant and you're going to have the project being performed in one of these regions, please do pay attention to the regional funding caps. Again, I would refer you to the RFA, section 2. This is all provided within the RFA. Okay, we're going to the next slide, slide 15. I did want to take some time here to note about partial grant funding. Just to point out that EPA does reserve the right to partially fund applications by funding discrete activities, portions, or phases of an application. And if EPA does decide to partially fund an application, it will do so in a manner that doesn't prejudice any applicant or affect the basis upon which the application will be evaluated or selected. I also want to point out that if you feel that, if it's just so should happen, that your grant work plan is going to be partially funded and you feel that the funds aren't going to be sufficient, you do have the flexibility to withdraw your grant, your application from funding consideration. So I just want to point out that you do have that option to withdraw your application. We're going to advance to slide 16 now and spend a little time on match requirements. Under this grant program, the match requirement is 5%. So for example, the federal government will provide 95% of the total allowable project cost, and then the recipient will need to provide the remaining 5%. So as you can see here, we're illustrating that. If the total project cost is $80,000, in order to meet the 5% match, the applicant would need to provide $4,000 in cash or in-kind contributions in order to be eligible to receive the $76,000 in federal grant funding. So, and again, this is all provided in section 2 of the RFA. I'm going to advance to slide 17. So just to sort of delve a bit deeper into cost sharing and matching, there's lots of ways you can provide the cost share. It can be through dollars, in-kind goods or services, such as volunteered time. You can get it through third-party contributions. Also, you could use university faculty time, can be used towards the, fulfilling the match requirement. Please know that the match requirement can be applied at different points during your work plan. It doesn't have to be met all at once. However, when you do put forth your application, you do need to document how the match is being used. It's critical that you do document in your project narrative how the match is being used. Okay, let's go to slide 18. Spending a little more time on the match requirement, just to note that the cost sharing and matching requirements are waived for applications that are under 200,000 from insular area applicants. And these applicants represent the U.S. Virgin Islands, American Samoa, Guam, and the Northern Mariana Islands. Insular area applicants with applications that require a cost share of $200,000 or more are advised to contact the applicable EPA region to determine if the cost share requirements will be waived in whole or in part. Okay, I'm going to go to slide 19. There are two types of grant, actually agreement types, financial agreement types that we issue through this grant program. One is a grant and the other is cooperative agreements. So under a grant, the award funds will be issued to your organization and EPA will not be involved in the performance of the grant work. However, if a cooperative agreement is issued, EPA will assume substantial involvement in the performance of the grant work. And so I would ask that you please see section 2C of the RFA, and there you will find a list of items that address how EPA would become substantially involved under a cooperative agreement. Okay, so now I'm going to go to slide 20. So the funding period, as I noted earlier, the funding is anticipated for 2 years. EPA will not issue an SRA RFA next year. The funding is generally to support 2 years of technical assistance. However, the recipient, we do want to note the recipient has the flexibility of allotting a third year to their work plan. Now, this third year would be to collect and report grant activities. So if the grant recipient feels they need more time to record and explain and report the grant activities back to EPA, then they could set aside funds for another third year. So I'm going to go to slide 21. Here you will see that we are addressing the national emphasis areas. The national emphasis areas for the program were created to focus resources and funding to generate more impactful and measurable results from our grants. They also allow us to facilitate the information from technical assistance and training to businesses on a nationwide scale. And then applicants are to choose at least one of the NEAs to focus in on for their grant applications. So we are going to address the NEAs, and here on slide number 22, here are the 5 NEAs. NEA number 1 is the food and beverage manufacturing and processing. NEA number 2 is chemical manufacturing, processing, and formulation. NEA number 3 is automotive manufacturing and maintenance. NEA number 4 is aerospace product and parts manufacturing and maintenance. And the 5th NEA is metal manufacturing and fabrication. And the NEAs are all related to our Smart Sectors initiative. And so on slide number 23, I do want to note again that we did hold a webinar on the NEAs. It was held last month. It was actually for our P2 grant program. However, as an SRA applicant, we do encourage you to seek out information from that webinar as a supplemental piece for guidance to help you prepare your SRA grant. And also the slides of that webinar presentation are in your handouts in the handouts tab. So you can download that now if you'd like. There is a lot of information offered, useful information offered in those slides and in the recording. So I do encourage folks to please access the webinar slides and recording, and you can access those from the grant homepage. Here we are displaying the website link. So once you get to that link, you would click on the Guidance on Applications tab to access the materials. I do also want to point out that there is supplemental information on the NEAs provided in the actual RFA. In Appendix A of the RFA, you will find a listing of the applicable industrial NAICS codes for each applicable NEA. And in Appendix B, you will find illustrative lists of examples of possible SRA grant projects that apply the NEAs. So please, what I want to leave with you here is that you have the webinar slides, you have the appendices, and you also have the recordings, and all this material is available to you. Okay, now I guess we're going to go to the next slide, and that's the question slide. So I will turn things over to Kat to go through the questions.
Thanks, Michelle. Hi, everyone. This is Kat Compton. I'm the Pollution Prevention Coordinator for Region 10 out of Seattle. And I just want to remind everyone to, if you have a question, please enter it into the question box on your webinar control panel. And we'll try to answer as many questions today as we can. If we're unable to answer your question, please do reach out and we can answer them via phone or email. To start, Michelle, there are just a couple of questions around eligibility, who is allowed to apply for this grant opportunity. Can you talk a little bit about whether or not private nonprofit colleges and universities are eligible?
Yeah, so nonprofits are eligible. Private colleges are eligible as well. So yes.
Great, thank you. And this request for applications is a national request for applications. However, you may have noted in the RFA that EPA Regions 1 and Regions 4 are not participating in this announcement. Michelle, can you talk about what that means for applicants that are located in EPA Region 1 and 4, and whether or not they would be able to apply for grant funds to do projects in those regions?
Yes. So if you are located in EPA Regions 1 or 4, the work, you could offer up a application. However, the project work would actually have to take place within one of the participating regions. So for example, say you are located in Massachusetts, and you would actually need to propose work in an eligible EPA region that's participating in this solicitation. So the work would have to be within, say, region 2 is participating, so the work would have to take place in New York, for example. So applicants from Region 1 and Region 4 can participate, but the project work has to take place in one of the EPA regions that is participating in the announcement. And we have 8 participating regions, and they're all listed there in the RFA.
Great, thank you, Michelle. There was a question that came in about whether these grants are focused on businesses alone. And I think what this question is trying to get at is whether or not these grant funds are focused on, whether or not they're focused entirely on providing technical assistance to businesses. Yes, that is the main goal of the P2 program here at EPA, is to provide technical assistance for businesses to implement P2 strategies into their processes. But I just want to clarify that for-profit businesses are not eligible for this grant funding opportunity. That's correct.
Yeah, for-profit businesses are not eligible. However, they could partner with an eligible entity, but they're not eligible to apply directly for grant funds.
But Michelle, This is Dan. Can the technical assistance be to a non-business?
It can be to a non-business, yes. So it could be, it can be to a business or more broadly to another entity.
So if you were the one that asked that question and you still need further clarification, please enter your question into the question box and we can circle back to that if you need more clarification. Michelle, there's a question here just on a couple of questions actually around formatting and the review process. So one is for putting your application together, if an applicant had 2 or 3 different projects, there's a question whether it makes more sense to address the first criteria, section A through H, separately by each project, or to blend those responses for all of the projects into one. Does EPA have a preference or a recommendation or have a scoring guideline based on formatting like that?
I'm not totally following that question. However, what I do want to emphasize here, it's critical that the application address every single threshold criteria. All the criteria need to be addressed. That's in section 3. Once your application addresses all the criteria, the threshold criteria, then it will be evaluated under the evaluation criteria in section 5. So we do provide the evaluation criteria there, and we do have a point scale for each criterion located in section 5. So I guess if there's other clarification on that question, we can come back to it, but that's what I would provide as guidance for now.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. And I'll just add that there is no, there's no scoring criteria based on sort of the location of the information in the application themselves. It's obviously easier for reviewers to see your responses follow the format that's laid out in the request for application. But reviewers are asked to look at the entire application in its entirety when they do their scoring. And they use the criteria that's listed in the RFA and the points assigned to each of those criteria as their scoring guidelines. We have another question here also about sort of scoring and whether or not the NEAs listed are weighted at all, whether there's preference given to applications that cover one or multiple NEAs. Can you clarify the NEA requirement, Michelle?
Sure. So no, there's not a preference given to any of the 5 NEAs. Applicants are required, though, to address at least one, but there isn't preference given to addressing any one in particular. Also, we score all applications the same. So if you decide to address 2 NEAs, that doesn't make your application more preferable as compared to an applicant that just addresses one. So we do not give preference to addressing more than one, and we do not give preference to addressing a particular NEA.
Great, thank you. There's a question here about providing clarification in in your application about sort of the geographic scope of your project. There is in the application a section for you to describe the target businesses that you aim to work with, and that of course will include a geographic scope of work as well. And so that is something that can be addressed in your narrative when you talk about the target businesses that you're aiming for in your project. There's a question here, Michelle, about cooperative agreements versus grants. Who decides whether a funding agreement would be a grant or a cooperative agreement? Is that EPA or is that the applicant themselves?
It'll be the EPA. that will make that decision.
Great, thank you. Question here about where to find pollution prevention opportunities or ideas for projects. Is there a centralized location where case studies are archived and available to search?
So a couple of points on that question. We do have, as I noted, Appendix B in the RFA provides some project examples that you can take a look at. Also, we do have grant summaries of the SRA grants, so grant awards that were issued. So you can check out the grant summaries tab on our P2 grant homepage, and there you will see all the grant summaries listed to date. Was there another part to that question?
No, I think that's great. Grant summaries, and then we do have case study listings at our website as well.
That's correct, yeah.
And this is, Dan, I think part of the reason why we're asking for case studies from our grantees is we want to begin to collect more systematically case studies and organize those into a database.
Great, thank you, Dan. On a related note, there's a question about sample applications here. We do not provide sample applications or examples of past successful applications. The best information would be to go to the grant summaries page on our website to look at previous projects and what we have funded in the past if you're interested in learning more about what projects have been successful in the past. Question here, Michelle, is it possible for P2 grantees to also receive source reduction assistance support? And how should those projects be distinguished?
So yes, applicants have done that in the past. So the distinguish is, you need to distinguish the project work. Obviously, we're not going to fund work that's already been funded with a P2 grant. So you do need to make sure that the project work is new and will not repeat the current project work. So you need to make clarification in your project narrative on how this differs. If you have an existing P2 grant, I would make an effort to point out how this work is different and does not duplicate the work of the P2 grant.
Thank you. There are a couple of questions here about delivering P2 technical assistance and what sorts of projects might be eligible for funding. Projects that deliver P2 technical assistance through site visits, facility audits, or trainings are certainly eligible activities. And then another question here about whether developing either training or technical assistance to help businesses in a particular jurisdiction adopt known technologies, whether that's eligible. Yes, that's an eligible activity if there are P2 best practices that are not being implemented by businesses in your jurisdiction. Developing a project to increase adoption of those P2 practices, either through P2 facility visits or other training activities, would be an eligible activity. There's a question here about whether or not we provide a template for the grant application. I'll refer you back to the request for applications. There is a section that provides a list of all of the components that we ask for to be included in the application itself. And then I'll also refer you to the scoring criteria, the evaluation criteria, so that you can see how the grants themselves will be scored and what reviewers will be looking for and the points that are associated with each section. Michelle, can you clarify how the Source Reduction Assistance Grant is different from the P2 grant opportunity?
Yeah, so there are a couple of big differences. One is the focus on, with the P2 grant, the main focus is on providing technical assistance to businesses. Under the Source Reduction Assistance Grant Program, the technical assistance can be provided to businesses and to other entities. Also, the match requirement is a statutory requirement under the P2 grant program, which is, and the match under that grant program is quite large, it's 50%. However, there are other elements to that, but under the Source Reduction Assistance Grant Program, the match requirement is only 5%. Also, the applicant pool under the two grant programs varies. Under the P2 grant program, applicants are only states and federally recognized tribes and colleges and universities that happen to be instrumentalities of the state. Under the Source Reduction Assistance Grant Program, the applicant pool is far wider, and we've gone over that previously in the presentation. So those are the main differences that I would point out.
Great, thanks, Michelle. I do see quite a number of more questions. I'm just doing a time check though. I wonder if it might be worth moving on with the rest of the presentation and we can circle back to questions at the end.
Yes, good. Okay, so Brian Clapp, my colleague in our division, is going to take the way and take on the presentation now for the performance measures. Brian?
Thank you, Michelle. Beginning on slide 25, a few notes about performance measures that applicants need to address. Applicants must provide a comprehensive plan for gathering and reporting on expected environmental outputs and outcomes of their proposed grant work. Grantees will be expected to follow up with all of the businesses they assisted over the course of the grant period to determine, as feasible, the P2 practices that were adopted or implemented. On slide 26, we'll talk about the outputs that SRA grant recipients that are required to report to the EPA. These include the number of case studies and other documentation products that describe specific P2 best practices that are developed or implemented through the grant, the number of amplification activities that widely share P2 practices and documentation, things like training, webinars, roundtables, or other types of outreach, the percentage of business facilities provided technical assistance that the grantee follows up with, whether these are a phone call, a site visit, a letter, an email to determine which P2 practices were implemented. There should be 100% follow-up with the facilities that received technical assistance. Another output that is required is the number of businesses facilities that provided technical assistance. And finally, the percentage of business facilities that implemented at least one new P2 practice as a result of the technical assistance that was provided. Next, on slide 27, we have a list of additional outputs that SRA grant recipients may want to report to the EPA. These give EPA and you a fuller sense of what your project accomplished. They include the number of stakeholder groups involved in the process, the number of technical assistance assessments or visits, the number of recommendations made to business facilities, the number of P2 recommendations that were implemented by business facilities, the number of innovations or best practices that were developed, the number of workshops, trainings, and courses that were conducted under the grant, the number of businesses that attended these workshops, trainings, and courses, the number of outreach materials that were developed, for example, fact sheets or leaflets, or the types of skills and abilities achieved by participants in said training. On slide 28, there are certain outcomes that SRA grantee recipients are required to report to the EPA. They include any reduction in pounds of hazardous materials used and of hazardous substances, pollutants, and contaminants released, reductions in the gallons of water used, reductions in metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent released, and the dollar savings achieved associated with achieving these reductions in hazardous materials use, hazardous releases, water use, and energy use, including any savings from a reduced regulatory burden. On slide 29, we want to put an emphasis on documenting and sharing the P2 best practices with others so that they can replicate this work. This includes the SRA grant reporting requirements. However, it's important to note that alternative reporting options are available as the technical assistance is broadly provided to multiple businesses or facilities. For example, a number of training courses, outreach materials, tool development, or roundtables. Next on slide 30, we want to give some detail on what we are expecting from required case studies. In your case studies, you need to provide technical information on one or two specific P2 practices so that other P2 technical assistance providers or interested businesses can learn from and replicate those practices. Guidance on the elements of a successful P2 case study are in Appendix F of the RFA. We are looking for grantees to report P2 practices that are new, not widely known or adopted, or where the grantee believes detailed information on the P2 practice could benefit other business facilities or pollution prevention technical assistance providers. EPA expects that each grantee will develop at least one of these case studies during the grant period. These case studies that are submitted by grantees will be used to build and share a body of knowledge about P2 practices that could be implemented at similar business facilities as we mentioned earlier. On slide 31, we have a little bit more information about requirements for grant reporting. Grant recipients are required to submit semi-annual progress reports during the project period and a final technical report at the completion of the grant. A schedule for the submission of these semi-annual reports will be established by the EPA region that's managing the grant award. Grant recipients will be expected to report on the outputs and outcomes of the grant as described in the Performance Measurement and Reporting Plan in Section 1H and Section 6C of the RFA. We understand that different work plans will yield and require different types of reporting information. For example, whether P2 recommendations were provided to technical assistance beneficiaries, or whether P2 technical assistance was more broadly provided to multiple businesses and facilities, for example, P2 training courses, outreach materials, tool development, or roundtables. On slide 32, just a little bit more detail on grant reporting. Grant recipients are encouraged to use a table and text to report facility-level P2 actions and results. For examples, please see the Technical Assistance Beneficiary Reporting Template that we have in Appendix E. A Microsoft Excel template is also available from your regional office and on the EPA website to record and report the required information. EPA will use this reported information to determine whether work plan requirements are being met satisfactorily and to build a repository of lessons learned that can be widely shared and replicated. On slide 33, just a few critical elements of the RFA that we want to reiterate. We want to draw your attention again to the fact that the deadline for applications has been pushed back to Friday, May 15th. Please pay close attention to the threshold eligibility criteria, as Michelle described previously, as well as the evaluation criteria and the overall submission process. On slide 34, we again encourage you to read the threshold eligibility criteria. The application must meet these criteria in order to be considered for funding, and only applications that meet all threshold eligibility criteria can be evaluated and ranked against the evaluation criteria in Section 5 of the RFA. Again, on slide 35, for the threshold eligibility criteria, applications must adhere to all statutory criteria and the definition of pollution prevention. A preponderance of the work must support pollution prevention. Your applications must address and support at least one of the national emphasis areas. Your application must describe how your work aligns with EPA's strategic plan and how it supports expected outputs and outcomes. Again, applications must be from eligible applicants as laid out in the RFA, and applications must adhere to the 5% match requirement, with the exception of those insular area applicants where the match requirement may be waived. There is more detail again about this in the RFA. Continuing on slide 36, only one application will be accepted and reviewed per applicant. If you submit more than one application for an identical project, whether in error or to replace a previously submitted application, EPA will only review the most recently submitted application unless you notify Michelle Amhaz. Her email is listed here, and specify which application you would like the EPA to review. All applications must comply with submission instructions. This includes a 14-page limit, including your cover page and project narrative. Applications must be submitted through grants.gov or an accepted alternative method, and any applications that are submitted late will be disqualified. On slide 37, we have some criteria listed by which your grant application will be evaluated. As far as evaluation goes, you must comply with the threshold eligibility criteria and submission requirement. Your scope of work must align with P2 and national emphasis areas. You must document compliance with cost share and match requirements, and you must clearly respond to all of the evaluation criteria. On slide 38, we have a few tips for preparing your application. We recommend that you start early and that you line up partners that are committed to completing the work. You should identify cash and in-kind resources that are needed to meet your match requirement, as well as cross-checking all your calculations on the match requirement. You need to provide detailed descriptions of your proposed work and clearly demonstrate the threshold and evaluation criteria. On slide 39, we want to draw your attention to some available resources as you prepare your application. In section 7 of the RFA, we have listed agency contacts that you can reach out to if you have questions during the application process. We would also encourage you to refer to EPA's National P2 Program Grants webpage. The URL is listed here. On that page, we have an FAQ for grant guidance, as well as a guidance for measuring P2 outputs and outcomes. We would also recommend that you reference the website of EPA's Office of Grants and Debarment Recipient Training Requirements and Opportunities. Again, that URL is listed here. I'll turn it back over to Kat at this point if we have additional questions.
Great, thank you, Brian. I just want to note the time. We just have a few minutes left in the hour, and so I know we've thrown a lot of information out on the webinar today. There are a lot of components to this request for application, and I just want to clarify that your best resource in preparing your application is going to be the request for application itself. There's a lot of detail and guidance on all of the different sections that we've talked about today that you can find online on our website, or if you go to the handouts tab in the webinar, you can download a copy of the RFA. In just the last few minutes, I want to just touch on some of the questions that have come in. Michelle, can you clarify the project years? This is entitled the FY20-21 request for applications. Can you clarify the 3-year project period for projects?
So SRA grants are going to be funded for 2 years of funding. We're going to be able to provide 2 years of funding. So if in that second year that you're receiving the funds, you can elect to set aside some of those funds and have them set aside for the 3rd year. So you have resources to do additional grant reporting or grant documentation of the activities that are happening within your grant. If you need that extra time, you can allocate a 3rd year. So that's basically for planning purposes. If you need extra time to plan and prepare, you can do that. But the grant itself will only be funded for 2 years. It's 2 years of funding, so FY20 and FY21.
Great, thank you, Michelle. There was a follow-up question to that. What is the start date for funding these awards?
So everything is anticipated at this point. We anticipate that we will have awards issued by September. This is all, again, anticipated funding. Normally, grant projects do start in October or November. However, there are a lot of challenges that we're all dealing with this year. So everything is anticipated. So that's how I would address that. If you have other questions, I would suggest that you follow up with your applicable region if you have any other questions regarding funding.
Yeah, and this is Dan Helfgott. I think I just want to clarify one thing. We refer to these as FY20-21 grants because they're using our budgeted money for FY20 and 21. But as Michelle described, the work would not be starting until generally October 1. So it's work that may be occurring, October, November, December, and then in 2021 and 2022. So it's the work itself is using FY20 money, but you're doing most of that work in 2021. I hope I didn't confuse it. Yeah.
Yeah, so we're just past the hour. I'm sorry if I wasn't able to get to your question today. I do have all of these questions recorded, and I'll do my best to get answers back to you in a timely manner. I'll also point to the regional contacts list that's listed in the request for applications. If you have any additional questions about the RFA or the grant application process, please do reach out to your regional point of contact and they can help facilitate an answer. And with that, I'll just again say that we did record the webinar today and we will post it to our website as soon as we can. Have a great afternoon, everybody. Stay healthy, and we will look forward to receiving your applications on May 15th. Thanks so much.
Thank you.